Blessings, beloveds. Welcome back to my channel, Anastasia, Cosmic Astrologer with you guys. And today's topic that I want to just spend maybe 15 minutes on, because it's a very, very long topic, is an aspect pattern called the Yod. There's been a couple of requests for this video, so I thought I'd sit down and do it for you guys today. But what I want to say first up is that this is an introduction. I am going to pinpoint some pretty important insights into understanding the Yod, but you must bear in mind that there is a lot more to it than what I'm going to say today. Also, I'm going to use Prince's chart as an example again, because he just happened to have a Yod in his birth chart, which is great because we can have a reference point to have a look at this Yod formation. Now, what is a Yod, first of all? A Yod, which is also sometimes referred to as the finger of God. It is a very fated, inherent aspect pattern in the birth chart. When you see a chart that has various aspect patterns, especially things like T-squares and Yods, there's something quite inherent in the birth chart for the individual that is described by those planetary patterns that basically speaks to their whole life. These patterns are not something that are resolved overnight. They take a long, long time. And with the Yod particularly, it's very, very challenging because what we have, a Yod is made up of 3 planets, 2 planets sextiling each other, and the third planet forming a quincunx to those 2 planets sextiling each other. I'll show you what that looks like when we look at Prince's chart so you can get a visual. If you understand aspects, you can pick this up just with your naked eye when you're looking at a chart. You can notice these configurations, but you have to have a fairly well-trained eye to picking up these aspects. Alternatively, a lot of computer programs will show you the different aspect patterns that exist in any given chart. All that aside, today's focus is the Yod, which involves 3 planets, as I've already said. The next thing I would like to bring to your attention, according to various authors and the material that I've read through the years, when we are looking at a Yod formation, what we generally need to be seeing as the third planet, which is also referred to as the apex planet, APEX. It's a very important point, this one. The apex planet is the one that really holds the Yod together, and it's also the fated point, or the point of frustration, or the point of challenge, and the point of ultimate transformation as well. This third planet, which holds this Yod together, by definition of an ideal Yod, that third planet is said to be ideal when it is an outer planet, such as Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, and especially Pluto, because the energy of Pluto is really reflecting what this Yod configuration really means, which is fate and destiny, willpower, and so forth. So, just speaking to a viewer who made a comment that most of the material she's come across has been around Yods, has been that it's a pattern that speaks to readjustments and so forth. The word readjustment comes from the fact that this Yod is made up of 2 quincunxes, what we call a quincunx. A quincunx aspect is an aspect that is formed through one planet to another, having a distance of 150 degrees apart. So another word for quincunx is inconjunct, right? So inconjunct or quincunx means the same thing. It's the same aspect. It's 150 degrees distance between one point to another, or one body to another body. And that quincunx aspect, which you may have in your chart just as a quincunx, not in a Yod necessarily, it is an aspect that really is defined by irritation and adjustments that need to be made, just to put very simply. Hence why a Yod may be spoken or reflected on in that way, suggesting that it's a point of adjustment and so forth, because that is a part of the pattern, but it's not the whole meaning to the pattern. So given it's called the finger of God, which is a very interesting term, it implies that the life of the individual has a very special destiny in some kind of way. Now, for some people, that might be a really huge life of fame in some kind of way, because it was for Prince, for instance. And for other people, it may not be something, it may not be a public figure or a public life, but it'll be something really fated and really powerful in their own life that they go through. Now, these patterns, as I said, they're inherent patterns that really point to or speak to the fact that this person has to work through something very specific, very, very important, very fated, and they can't ignore it. And these patterns are something that we need to work through throughout our whole life, these sorts of aspect patterns, T-squares and yods. But what seems to be the case is that a yod configuration can lie dormant, as it were, in the birth chart in the person's life, in that it may appear as though not much is happening around that particular configuration and what it means. And the houses that it's in, of course, as well, because we need to take into account the houses that the yod is in. But what seems to happen is that that yod will be activated in a person's life at some particular point. And that activation is usually seen through transits and progressions. So if, for example, you had transiting Pluto forming an aspect to that yod, to one of those points in that yod, and let's just say it happened to be the third planet, which is the apex planet, well, that will open up and trigger and activate the entire energy of that yod. And therefore, that would begin that journey of the fork in the road, because that's another term for a yod. It's an experience where we come to a point in life, usually through crisis, by the way, where we are presented with a fork in the road, and there's a sense of no clear vision of what's ahead, but there's a very deep inner understanding that there's necessity for change, and there's a necessity to choose which fork, which road you're going to take. That knowing is there, but the result of what's to come when you step that way or step that way is completely unknown, and that can bring up a lot of fears and a lot of fears around inadequacy and uncertainty and things of that nature. But usually what happens is when that person is in that situation and that yod is triggered and they do step into the path, once they are on that path, what they will soon realize is the tremendous potential they have for the capacity to actually work with this yod energy and what it's bringing up for them and what it is that they need to be ultimately stepping into. But that doesn't become clear until they step into it. So there's a sense of fear or caution when a critical situation does present to them, because it's a sense of unknown. You know, what do I do here? Which path do I take? So that's part of how the yod pattern experience surfaces in a person's life. As I said, authors suggest that third planet needs to be an outer planet for it to be an ideal yod. But that's not to say that we don't take into account a yod that is formed by the third planet, the apex planet, from a slower moving planet. Because in the case of Prince, as you will see in a moment, his yod, the third planet, which is the apex planet, is actually Mars. So it's not an outer planet, it's an inner planet. But it's so telling and so fitting for what happened in his life. Now, let me just see something before I go on to the next part. Let me just read a couple of things to you guys. Okay, a yod ready for activation meaning when a Yod is triggered by a transiting planet or a progressed planet, that's when the Yod is activated, right? As I said before that, it mostly feels like it's lying dormant and not much is really happening. But what is actually happening is there's an internal process and preparation that's actually going on that the individual is usually not conscious of, right? So it's an internal process of preparation of what the person is going to do when that Yod is actually triggered. So it says here, a Yod ready for activation is very much like arriving at a fork in the road and nevertheless having to proceed further in one direction or another without securely knowing where either route is definitely going to lead to, which is what I just said a minute ago. We are simply aware that we must veer off onto another path. This change, of course, is not really a matter of conscious, deliberate decision-making due to any full awareness of potentials involved. See, awareness is something that is stimulated and emerges from the aspects of opposition. Oppositional aspects are what bring crystallization and awareness into things. But the Yod is not made up of oppositions. It's made up of sextiles, which means opportunity, but it's also made up of two quincunxes, which means severe adjustment, severe change that needs to take place, not just for a day. It's a very powerful, significant change that changes the course of the person's life and what they're actually doing with their life. Although this new direction, once embarked upon, may appear abrupt and unaccounted for, it has been accumulating strength and definition for a period of many years. Yet once the time for the Yod to be activated is right, the individual typically drops or psychologically lets go of certain interests and habits in order to become involved in enterprising attitudes and activities coming up the horizon. And although he may first feel a bit uncertain or even inadequate, which I just explained a moment ago, the person ends up feeling surprised as to how much ability they have to actually deal with this new path that they are embarking on. Okay. If the preparation has enabled him to operate at a more effective level of consciousness, the potential energy of the sextiling planets can allow him to make intelligent and innovative adjustments in the social environment, or at least in those personal areas of life ruled by the houses involved by the Yod, and especially the house occupied by the apex planet, which is the third planet. The other thing that's important to note, when there is a planet opposite the apex planet, I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, which can often be the case in the configuration of a Yod in a person's chart. If there's a planet opposite the apex planet, which is not part of the configuration, it just happens to sit directly opposite the apex planet, that planet can become very important in the process and the experience of this Yod. And it's not an easy point because that planet that sits opposite the apex planet can be disruption or difficulty in managing this Yod because it's an oppositional point, but it can also bring awareness as well. Okay, and this is just to add further to what I was just saying. The reaction point, which is the opposite point to the apex planet, if there's a planet there, it's a very sensitive point, he says. It pinpoints that focused area where the individual's new orientation will center itself for better or for worse. So it really figures into this aspect pattern Yod. The passing of transits or natal progressions over this reaction degree should be noted very carefully. So quite apart from looking at transits or progressions hitting off this Yod, hitting off one of the points in this Yod, because that's all you need. You just need one planet to form a significant aspect to one of these three planets in the Yod configuration, such as a square, opposition, or conjunction, and boom, off it goes. That Yod is activated. the forks in the road appear. The decision needs to be made. The uncertainty rises. But ultimately, this all leads to the destiny that the person is supposed to follow. Now, the opposite point that I was talking about of the apex planet, if a planet via transit or progression triggers that planet, an equal experience can occur. Something happens and that yod gets triggered again. Not to the extent when a planet is transiting or is progressing over one of the three planets of the yod, but it still has meaning and significance. Okay. Particularly when it's the higher octave planets, which are the transpersonal planets, Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, pay very close attention. The outer planets, because they move so slowly as well, the implication will be that yod, when it gets triggered by an outer planet via transits or progressions, and especially if it's progressions, it could be years. You know, the person could be experiencing the activation of this yod for a number of years. If it's transits, it could be anywhere up to 2 years, right? So it's a fairly significant length of time. So, and that makes sense because this yod is, when it is activated, you're not changing the car that you drive. You know, it's very profound changes leading to your destiny and what you are here to work through, and the destiny you are here to embark on and understand. Okay, leave that there for a moment, and what I will do is just quickly share my screen, and I want to show you Prince's chart, and I'm going to show you something really super fascinating as well. So here is Prince's chart, Prince the singer, okay? Born on the 7th of June 1958, 6:08 p.m., Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, you see Mars over here in the 5th house at 0 degrees of Aries. By the way, this yod is out of sign, okay? So if you're not very experienced with aspects and with aspect patterns, you wouldn't even notice this, right? But you can have aspect patterns or aspects that are out of sign, okay? Maybe some of you don't understand what I mean by that, and I don't have time to go into that for this video. So I'll do a basic video of aspects when aspects are formed through the correct sign element, because aspects really describe element to element. So, for example, a trine aspect is always water to water, fire to fire, air to air, etc., etc. I'll do another video on that just to give some foundation, some basics on that so you can get your head around this. But for the moment, just be aware that this particular yod is out of sign, but it is still a yod because of the degrees, all right? It's a very tight orb. And orb is another thing that you need to consider as well when you are looking at aspects. If an aspect is 12, 14, 15 degrees apart, well then, you know, forget about it. And with certain aspects, you would only allow a 2 to 3 degree orb, right? So there's different aspects, different orbs, etc. Go into that in another video. Mars at 0 degrees of Aries, okay, forms a quincunx to Pluto, okay? The reason it forms a quincunx to Pluto is because Pluto is at the last degree of Leo. So it only needs, technically speaking, it only needs 3 minutes before it goes into Virgo, okay? Because it's 59 minutes of Leo, so it's got 3 minutes left before Pluto jumps into Virgo. Now, Virgo is quincunx Aries, okay? Leo is not quincunx Aries. Leo is actually trine Aries. See, fire to fire, that's a trine. But what we have here is a quincunx because Pluto is about to go into Virgo. The orb is literally 3 minutes, right? So there's a quincunx from Mars to Pluto. Now, Pluto forms a sextile to Neptune and the North Node as well. Now, here again, this aspect is out of sign, okay, this sextile, but because Neptune is only 2 degrees of Scorpio and the North Node is 0 degrees of Scorpio, the orb is very tight. Don't worry about the technical component of this for now. Just understand that Pluto forms a sextile to Neptune in the North Node, all right? And Neptune forms a sextile to Pluto, and the North Node forms a sextile to Pluto. This is a Yod, sextile, Neptune to Pluto, Pluto to Neptune, Mars, Quincunx Pluto, and Mars, Quincunx Neptune, all right? So as I said before, this configuration is made up of 3 planets, 2 planets sextiling each other, and the 3rd planet forming a quincunx or inconjunct, which is 150 degrees away. If you were to count from 0 Aries to 0 Scorpio, you'll find that it's approximately 150 degrees apart, okay? And the same with Pluto to Mars, okay? The distance there is about 150. So the apex planet that I was referring to earlier, and I was saying it's the 3rd planet, this is it here, it's Mars. So whatever planets you have in the configuration or aspect pattern of a Yod, which is 3 planets, the apex planet or the 3rd planet is always the one on the opposite end of those other 2 planets, or in a quincunx point, right? This is the 3rd planet. This is the apex planet. The apex planet really holds this whole Yod formation together. The apex planet is the most important planet in this configuration, all right? It's the fork in the road that will emerge later. It is this planet, when it gets triggered off, that creates significant change in the person's life from a point of destiny, okay? Now, as I said earlier, the books say that this 3rd planet ideally should be an outer planet, such as Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, as the apex planet in order for it to be a perfect Yod, okay? But nevertheless, when we have other planets at this point here as the 3rd point, the apex planet, we still need to pay attention to that. And Prince's chart is 100% proof of that. And there would be numerous other examples as well, but I dug up this one because I love working with Prince's chart, and it's a very powerful example. Now, okay, so that's the Yod, as you can see. And, you know, understand and realize that, imagine how important this Yod is in the sense of the apex planet is in his 5th house, which is what? The house of creativity, right? He was one of the most creative people, genius, musically, on a number of different levels. So we're talking about a highly artistic individual who had a Yod in his chart with the apex planet in his creative house, the 5th house, the Leo house, and in Aries, right? This Mars in Aries, being the apex planet, was a problem. It was a problem, and it created a lot of conflict as well. And the way to understand it from the point of view of Prince's life, and I'm going to read you for today what the Mars as the apex planet in a Yod, what it actually means, because every Yod is experienced differently and has a different meaning, first of all, based on the planets that can figure in the Yod. That's number one. Number two, the planets in the Yod, what houses are they in? Because the houses that they're in are going to draw in the narrative of the story and the destiny of the person's life. And the apex planet is going to be the key player. It's the primary focal point of this configuration called the Yod. This is the big boss, the big guns, right? So in Prince's chart, we clearly can see that this Yod draws in his creativity, his artistry, and his public life and career and life direction, because look at where Pluto is. It's right up there on the midheaven in the 10th house, which is life direction, public life, etc. And the Neptune in the 12th really is very complex, but very briefly put, it brings in a lot of different dimensions. You could say it brings in karmic, past life things that needed to be resolved this lifetime, matters that were fairly unconscious as well. matters that were very transpersonal, transcendental. So there's quite a few different layers we can explore with this Yod. But it's pretty clear that this Yod really does describe his life and his destiny. And his destiny was to be who he was. There's no doubt about that. Even just Pluto in the midheaven, that alone describes a very special destiny in the public arena, okay? And certainly the power struggles and conflict that he experienced with the record industries, right, which were that experience for him was life-changing on a number of different levels. And you'll understand why when I read you what Mars as an apex planet means in this Yod configuration. And perhaps I will do that now. Or actually, before I do, what I want to show you guys is this, which is just freaking mind-blowing. And this, I'm going to show you Prince's secondary progress chart. But the method that I use is a very unique method that is not used by any other astrologer other than the astrologer that has taught me how to work with secondary progressions, and which is primarily how I rectify people's birth charts. Very complex. It's very tedious. It's very time consuming, and it's not my favorite part of astrology, I can assure you, but I know that it's 100% accurate. So, having said all of that, if you look to this chart here, sorry, wrong chart. This chart here. Now, you can see up here I've written Prince secondary progress chart to death date. Now, you look at this date here, 4th of August, 1958 at 6:45 p.m. It's for the same location of his birth. Now, this is how secondary progressions work, right? Actually, I don't really want to go into explaining secondary progressed methods because that's a whole course. That's not a 5-minute conversation. But what you can very clearly see here is that this date correlates to the amount of days after his death via a progress method. Each day, 1 day equaling 1 year, approximately, okay? It's not as clear-cut as that, but it's approximately. So if you were to count from what's his birth date, 7th of June until the 4th of August of the same year, what you will find is that equals to 58 days. And he died at the age of 58, okay? So 58 days equals 58 years. Hence, this is a secondary progress chart, which mirrors what was happening 58 days after his birth via a secondary progress method. I'll just leave it at that without explaining any more, just to hopefully help you understand a little bit if you're not familiar with secondary progressions, because they are very advanced. Anyway, what I want you to pay attention to here is the 4th house. This is his secondary progress chart to his death. So everything has moved. The rising sign has changed. The 2nd house cusp has changed. The 3rd house, and so on and so forth. Every single planet has changed its location. The outer planets haven't moved very much. I mean, look at this. Remember, Pluto in his natal chart was at 29 degrees of Leo, wasn't it? We'll go back to that. You can see it in a moment. Look at where it's moved to 58 days after his death. It's only moved to 1 degree of Virgo. So it's moved 1 degree. Okay. So the outer planets don't change that much in their movement because they move so slowly. However, the angles of the chart, the moon, of course, and the other inner planets, slower moving bodies, Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Venus, have moved fairly, significantly over a 58-day period, which equals to 58 years of life, right? So going back to the IC down here, now when he was born, he didn't have 8 degrees of Taurus on his IC, okay? I'll just show you what he had so you can see the difference. You see what he had? He had 27 degrees of Aquarius on his IC. But 58 days later, 58 years later, what happens is as you progress this chart, he ends up with Taurus down here, okay? So let's go back to the progress chart. Okay, 8 degrees of Taurus. Look at where Mars is. 8 degrees of Taurus. Boom, boom. Okay, let me explain what that means. First of all, remember that Mars was the apex planet of a Yod in his chart. And it's a part of his destiny. That whole Yod describes the hugest component of his life and destiny, what he was here to work through. When he died, that Mars via progression was exactly conjunct the IC. So that Mars has been activated through his progress chart, okay? It's a very important planet, that Mars, for him. It literally was the final thing that reflects the end of his life, okay? Now, the IC, which is the 4th house, by the way, in ancient astrology, the 4th house represents the end of matters, including the end of life, all right? So the sign on the IC, for instance, reflects a lot about the last sort of moments of our life here on Earth, okay? That's another level. So Mars on the IC is the ending of his life. This is via a secondary progression. Now, if you are to do a secondary progress chart via solar fire, for example, you're not going to see this configuration down here, because this method has been calculated in a different way to how solar fire calculates secondary progress charts. Okay, that's just a fact. You can try it and see it for yourself. So this is the stunning thing that I wanted to share with you guys. Here is the secondary progress chart according to the method that I have learned, which, you know, I will probably teach in a course down the track. But for now, this is what I wanted you guys to see. Here's Mars, ending of life. We can go further and unpack this. It was in his home. He died in his home, 4th house. The death is Mars really fits in because, well, it's sort of hard to say because there's not, I don't know who knows the truth, but I know someone out there does. But in my opinion, I'm not sure that he just died on his own, you know, that he just carked it like that just for whatever reason. He was found dead in the elevator of his home. And if you remember one of his songs from back in the 80s, from the Purple Rain album, one of the lines in his songs was, "Don't let the elevator take you down." I don't know if you guys know his music well enough, but if you do, you'll remember that line in a song. And you know, it's a little bit ironic, isn't it, that he died in an elevator just suddenly, just like that. And of course, you know, the media and all the forces and sources out there that like to say what they say, you know, pointed it all to, he was taking really strong medication and he wasn't well. And, you know, that's what they said about Michael Jackson as well, didn't they? So anyway, look, I don't know the 100% truth. I can't say I do, but I am very suspicious of his death, and especially with this secondary progress Mars down here on the IC. On the other hand, we could also say that it was quite fated, beyond what our left brain consciousness could ever begin to comprehend and understand, or even accept for that matter. Because if we understand the meaning of a Yod, as I said, it's a destined, fated configuration that leads one's life in a particular direction, okay? And sometimes a lot of the reasons underneath that can't really be understood from that ego left brain level, okay? It's a soul thing. The soul's driving a lot of this. Now, so if I can just read you what it says here about Mars as the apex planet in a Yod. So if this is you, if you have Mars as the apex planet, then you'll relate to this. I will do subsequent videos where I discuss all the other planets at the apex point in reference to my material here, okay? But for today, we're just doing Mars because we're looking at Princess chart. And as I said, Mars is the apex planet. Okay, apex Mars denotes, and listen to this, please listen to this, because you'll really get a feel for how this played out in Prince's life. Certainly if you're a fan of his and you've followed him and you understand some components of his life, because he was a very private person, as I've said many times. But see how this resonates with your with any insight you have about him. And remember, while I'm reading this, just remember what he went through with the record industries, right? Where for many years, you know, he withdrew from all record industries. He basically became his own person. He created his own labels. He reinvented himself, made a comeback through his own doing and his own choices. He didn't let anybody sign him up. He just did everything himself. Now, I'm just wrapping that up in 1 minute, but can you imagine what that journey was like? You know, big figure like that, basically sticking it up the mainstream record industries and companies. That took a lot of courage, and that was a big step to take. And that's part of his Mars in this Yod configuration, and you'll hear it as I read. Apex Mars denotes an individual who starts off in life inefficiently applying his physical energies or having difficulty initiating personal matters in a direct and open manner. The method in which he asserts himself may often be in need of a correction and alteration. His active efforts may miss the mark for quite some time until he learns to bring his inner drive into clearer focus with the actual capacity to act upon situations with greater organizational intelligence. Otherwise, this individual is prone to plunge into activities without any sense of purposeful direction. Bear with me, because as I continue, you will start to understand more. He's also likely to have to make adjustments concerning his aggressive instincts. See, the word adjustments comes in because we're talking about the apex planet forming a quincunx to the other two planets, which form this Yod pattern, right? So adjustment is necessary. And the apex planet, whatever it may be, in this case it happens to be Mars, that's the planet that's going to go through significant adjustments. But they are adjustments that lead to destiny, you know? They're not minor things. Okay. He typically tends to try to control the external release of strong passions, but then can turn to these urges back on himself in a self-defeating manner. Or else he may exhibit displaced anger, aiming his hostility at inappropriate targets. With apex Mars, the individual may feel uncomfortable with his sexual tensions and may not find adequate outlets for the needed release. In general, he can be out of tune with himself due to his indirect approaches towards satisfying his desire nature. Now listen to this further. Once this Yod is ripe for activation, which is, in other words, it is triggered through a very significant transit or progression. Now, the example I gave, sure, it was, about the end of his life, but it's so powerful and it's so vivid. How could I not bring that to you and show that to you? I know that if I look back, look at the time when he had that falling out with the record industries and where he just stood on his own ground and followed what he believed and wasn't going to be, a slave, because remember, he wore the word slave written on his cheek for years. Well, that's what that whole thing was about. He wasn't going to be a slave to the consensus world. He was a very strong-willed individual who wanted to be and represent himself for who he was, not fabricated or manipulated or have others tell him what he should sing, how long the songs should be, and what he should wear and how he should dance. And he stood up to that, and he said, basically, screw you, I'm doing my own thing. How many artists have done that? Not many, right? So this is that apex Mars that has triggered this whole journey and experience for him. Once the Yod is ripe for activation, the individual can find himself centered upon a new life course requiring him to mobilize his vital forces in an extremely demanding manner. This new period of life, he may manifest somewhat suddenly, perhaps under an acute crisis situation, compelling him to undertake dynamic, pioneering new starts involving courage and daring. Now, if that doesn't actually describe what he went through, then I don't know what does. At this point, he may become keenly aware that he must independently take full charge of his life and demonstrate complete self-sufficiency. His life's tempo now no longer allows him to waver, vacillate, or be indirect in action, but instead forces him to respond with much vigor and decisiveness. As an apex planet, forceful Mars could suggest that the individual might have to sever ties from the past or directly break away from the former comforting securities during this appointed time of self-confrontation. He is to one-pointedly focus all his attention upon this new path and learn to adapt rapidly. Once he establishes a clear review of matters here, this individual could become quite energized to work hard and become industriously busy with the enterprising phase of his life. He's normally able to operate alone, unhampered by others to great extent. Okay, so there you have it. There's the interpretation of Mars as the apex planet of a Yod. Now, that literally describes the core of Prince's life and what he went through. And to me it does. I hope it does to you as well. It's pretty clear. So there you have it. There's one example of a Yod. Mars is the apex planet, and in the case of Prince's chart, we can see the apex planet being in the house of creativity. And, you know, the Pluto, Quincunx, up there in the 10th house, it was his public life. You know, it was his public self. It was his life direction, his fate, his destiny, all of that. And he was very public. Although he was a very private individual, he was very public and open about what he did with these record companies and how he stuck it up them and just basically did what he felt he needed to do with his craft. And you've got to love him for that. If you don't love his music, which I cannot understand if somebody doesn't, I'm being biased because I love him, I know. But all right, let's just say you don't like his music. You must absolutely give credit to the balls that it took to do what he did, the courage that it took to do what he did, the power, the will, the fearlessness. You know, that's Mars. Mars in the Aries is fearlessness. Fearlessness. Okay, I'm going to leave it here. I have my best friend in hospital at the moment. So it's been a really rough few days, actually. Very emotional time and not an easy period. So anyway, that's life. You know, we have to deal with things as they arise. I hope this video was useful and helpful, and I hope it's clarified or given you a little bit more about the meaning of the Yod and just, in fact, how powerful and important it is in a person's life. So leaving it there and sending much love and blessings to all of you. Feel free to contact me for a reading, any kind of reading. I offer many different types. If you're not sure, email me, ask me. If you have questions, I'm happy to respond. Thank you to the new subscribers, and thanks to all of you for all your comments and questions. Keep it going. I love the interaction. I appreciate it, and I love it when you guys engage with each other as well, because that's another way of learning. And, you know, that's the whole point of this. The whole point and purpose of me doing these videos is to share, you know, to share with all of you my experience, my understanding, my learning, and so forth, and hopefully impart some wisdom and knowledge and information to you guys as well. And ultimately just really enjoying doing this, really feeling, you know, it's my calling, my soul's calling. So There you go. See you guys soon. Much love and blessings. Take care. Bye for now. Thanks.